Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
UFORadio-International podcast show.
He confirmed that there was interest at the highest levels. He confirmed that people were sworn to secrecy about this, and had it been a Mogul balloon, that wouldn't have been that big a deal.
From the statements of witnesses that I've seen or read, a number of individuals described that whatever it was that was recovered near Roswell, that apparently it was put in a special plane that was flown in for this purpose, and that the materials were under armed guards, because people described the MPs. And I think it's logical to say that weather balloons aren't normally flown by special planes under armed guard. So that by itself at least raises a legitimate question as to, was this a weather balloon?
This is your host, Giuliano Marinkovic. Thank you for being with me once again on the UFO Radio International podcast show, only here on Omnitalk Radio. And today is July 8, 2017. And it is 70th anniversary of the press release that was issued by Roswell Army Air Force Base, where 509 bomb group was stationed. And at that day, on July 8, 1947, they released that the unit had came into possession of the flying disc. And this is initial beginning of the infamous Roswell incident. Of course, the press conference was organized on the same day in Fort Worth, Texas, and the first initial story was withdrawn, and the new explanation was offered that Air Force actually found the remains of the weather balloon. And in 1990s, we had two additional explanations. Air Force then offered the third explanation. They withdrew the weather balloon solution of the case, and they offered the story of the Project Mogul, secret operation to detect sounds from Soviet atomic tests. And in 1997, they offered the fourth explanation, trying to resolve alleged reports of alien bodies. And Air Force now claims that they were confused with test drop dummies that Air Force were using for training operations. So we have gone through four explanations so far, but how the case stands today? In these few days when the anniversary of the case is celebrated, many TV and radio stations around the world are devoting their minutes to the incident. Even the BBC produced 3 shows. And what I'm seeing is sort of a general consensus in the mainstream media that this is military confusion, folklore, and the modern myth. However, we will do our take of the case today. I have decided to contact one of the most prominent researchers of the Roswell case, Mr. Kevin Randle. And we will break down the case in great detail, and we will try to see, can the Project Mogul explanation, can it still hold today? If we will delve into the facts, we will confront that with official explanation. So, Kevin Randle, here, only on Omnitalk Radio and UFO Radio International, in a minute.
They didn't say, Congressman Schiff, we have documents, but they're classified. You're going to have to go through certain procedures if you want access to them. That would have at least been a reasonable response. But to send me to an agency which doesn't have the documents, and by now they must know that, that is not a reasonable response. And it was at that point that I asked our General Accounting Office to assist me.
I'm happy to welcome tonight, well, it's day at his side of the planet, Mr. Kevin D. Randle, long-term researcher of the UFO phenomena, well respected in the field and respected from myself. I'm following his work for years. And last time I did a sort of anniversary of the Kenneth Arnold sighting show with Bruce McAndrew. And I'm saying, what the heck, now it's the Roswell anniversary 70th, and we will have it only once. So I guess I have to organize something. So I sent Kevin a short email. He really responded promptly. I'm so glad that he is with us. And today I also saw even the BBC had the anniversary about the Roswell incident with their show too. And I'm following all these articles. Everybody is commenting the case, saying that it's a sort of folklore and a myth and so on. But I think we should go straight to the source, and I think Kevin will provide a great insight into the case as one of the prominent researchers there. So we will see actually what the data inside the case stands today, how it is strong, how it is not strong, so we can delve into that. But before we go into that, because Kevin, I know you have such a rich biography, maybe you can give some highlights for the listeners and to tell us how you become interested in the Roswell case in the first place.
I became interested in UFOs, and I always blame my mother for that because she had an interest in science fiction. And science fiction is about alien space travel and alien civilizations and alien visitation and all of that sort of thing. And it's not a big step from that into UFOs, which is about the reality of alien civilizations and alien visitation and that sort of thing. So she kind of sparked my interest in UFOs in that way. When we moved specifically to the Roswell case, I had been at a science fiction convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Don Schmidt was going to show up with a fellow from CUFOS, the Center for UFO Studies, and we were going to debate the reality of UFOs. I was with the science fiction writers, which was Frederick Pohl, and I forget who the other guy was, and it was going to be Don Schmidt and the guy from CUFOS arguing the pro side of the case, and we were going to argue the con side. And when we got to that point, it turned out the guy didn't show up with Don. He was going to be alone, and I didn't think it was fair to be 3-on-2. And since I was conversant in the topic, I said, well, I'll just switch sides and be with Don and on the pro side for the debate. Because in a debate, that's what you do. You take whatever side is assigned to you. And after the debate was over, Don and I got to talking about some of these things, and it wasn't long before he had asked me if I wanted to participate in their Roswell investigation. They had learned that there was a lot of things that hadn't been done, a lot of leads that had not been followed, and they needed somebody to assist with that. And because of my military background, they thought I would be of a benefit to them because I could relate to the military people. I had a long and extensive military background myself. In fact, I just retired, and I shouldn't say just, I retired from the Army in 2009. I had a combat tour in Vietnam, a combat tour in Iraq, and so they thought because of that background and that sort of thing that I would be able to relate to the military people, the retired military people, better than a civilian. I would understand things that military people would understand, but civilians who had not been associated with the military might not get. And as a best example of that, we had heard repeatedly, I think it's in a number of books, that General Ramey's aide was Colonel Thomas Dubose. Well, I knew as a military officer that a brigadier general does not have a full colonel as an aide, and it turns out Dubose's position was really the chief of staff, which is a much more important position than the aide to a brigadier general. A full 4-star general can have a colonel for an aide, but a brigadier general normally has a captain or a first lieutenant as his aide. So I was brought into the Roswell investigation of that, but I thought we were going to go down to Roswell. We'd spend a couple of days there, and we would learn what it is. It would be a balloon or something mundane. And the first day we were there, we met with a new age-oriented group in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I thought, well, this isn't helping us at all. And then we got down to Roswell, and we met with Cliff Stone, and he really didn't know anything new and important. He was more interested in arguing about the reality of UFOs, and that didn't help. And then I had set up an interview with Bill Brazel, the son of the man who had originally found the debris, Mac Brazel. We got out and met with him. And once we were done with that, I realized that we weren't going to solve this case in a matter of hours. We were going to have to come back because there were other leads that had developed. One fellow said to me at one point, "Do you want to meet the family of Sheriff Wilcox?" Wilcox being the Roswell sheriff. And I said, "Of course I do." And so we had to come back to investigate it. And the whole thing kind of snowballed from there, because every time we thought we had kind of exhausted the information that we could gather in the field, a bunch of new leads would come up, and we'd find ourselves back in New Mexico talking to other people. Or we ended up in Arizona once talking to people. We ended up in Washington State talking to people. We ended up in California. So we were all over the United States, or the western part of the United States, talking to various people that had some connection with this, from Sheridan Cabot, who was the counterintelligence officer at Roswell, who went with Jesse Marcel out to the field. We ended up in Montana talking to Jesse Marcel Jr. and Vo Marcel, Jesse Sr.'s wife. We ended up in Washington State talking to Cabot. We ended up in California talking to Sappho Henderson, who was the wife of Pappy Henderson, who flew some of the debris to right field at the time. So, I mean, we were all over the country. That kind of brings, I guess, everything together, how I got interested in the UFOs, how I ended up in the Roswell case, and a little bit of the evolution of how the investigation took place.
We can fairly say that you definitely know cast of characters, and before we go deeply into the investigation itself, I was thinking, and I'm seeing that some people today, when the Roswell is mentioned, they simply have some kind of a irritating reaction, and I also hearing lots of generalizations and everything. So I was thinking maybe we could really go down to basics, give just the highlights, the basic chronology, how everything happened, and we can sort of build from there. So if we could go back to that July in 1947 and how actually everything developed in the first place.
What we have is Mac Brazel, who was a rancher, an old-time cowboy. I mean, when you think of cowboys, he's like an old-time cowboy. In New Mexico. In fact, his, and I digress already, his brother was Wayne Brazel, who killed Pat Garrett, who killed Billy the Kid. And so the Brazel family has a history of New Mexico in that era. And so Mac Brazel is out on the range. He's looking at the pastures to see which one had received rain from the thunderstorms the night before, and came across this field filled with metallic debris. And he didn't know what it was, couldn't figure it out. But it was such a mess that he wondered who was going to clean it up, because it wasn't something that he could do easily. He showed some of the debris to his closest neighbors, Floyd and Loretta Proctor, who described this little piece that he had brought to him, and they didn't know what it was. So eventually he went to the Chaves County Sheriff, Roswell being in Chaves County, and talked to the sheriff about it, taking some of the debris with him to kind of show what it was. The sheriff then called out to the air base, and because Jesse Marcel was the air intelligence officer, the call eventually ended up in his hands. He went out to the sheriff's office, talked to Brazel, realized that they needed to go out, went back to the base, talked to the base commander, Colonel Blanchard, who said, you've got the CIC guy, Counterintelligence Corps, not the same as the CIA. CIA is something different. Counterintelligence Corps is a branch of the Army that deals with intelligence functions. And the two of them followed Brazel back to the ranch. They saw the debris. They picked some of it up, brought it back to the base. Blanchard, for some unknown reason, issued a press release that said they had captured a flying saucer. And the whole thing kind of blew up. Told Walter Hott, the public information officer, put out a press release, which he did. The whole thing blew up. Marcel ends up going to Fort Worth, which is the headquarters of the 8th Air Force. The unit at Roswell was part of the 8th Air Force. Go to the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, where Brigadier General Ramey is. The photographs are taken there, clearly of a ray wind target, clearly of a weather balloon. Everybody says, okay, that's it, we're done, it's just a weather balloon, and goes on. But Marcel then later explained to others, and by later, I mean like 35 years later, that he had been responsible for picking up the remains of a flying saucer, which came to the attention of, I think, first Stan Friedman, and later on Len Stringfield, and finally Bill Moore got involved, and that ended up in the book The Roswell Incident. They interviewed a bunch of people, including Walter Haupt. Walter Haupt provided a lot of interesting leads for us as we did our investigation. So I mean, that's a snapshot. It blew up in just a matter of hours. It was suddenly the number one story in the nation, and within 2 or 3 hours, it was just, well, it's the weather balloon, who cares type thing, and it was overlooked simply because there seemed to be an explanation for it, and nobody was really looking at UFO crashes as being anything legitimate, especially after the Aztec hoax of 1948 in the book Behind the Flying Saucers blew up, meaning that it was found to be full of inaccuracies, to be, I guess, polite about it. But so when you get a story of a flying saucer crash, nobody was really listening to those. And then, Stan Friedman got this, and talking to Jesse Marcel, and I think Marcel couldn't really remember the year, but knew it had been at Roswell, that he'd been in Roswell, and Moore looking for some information. And anybody who does research this way would have found this eventually if they'd known about Marcel. You look at the newspapers from 1947, and eventually you come to the story of the Roswell case, and there's pictures of Marcel on the front pages, and there's pictures of Ramey and DuBose and all of that on the pages. So once you had Marcel telling the story, it was only a matter of time before somebody blundered into a newspaper that gave you the information, and from there you could run with the whole thing. So that kind of initiates the new investigation. Moore and I guess Friedman pretty much ran the investigation. They published the book, The Roswell Incident, which didn't make much of a splash. I remember seeing it when it first came out and thought, oh God, it's just Aztec repackaged. Who cares? And it wasn't until I was invited into the case that I began to look at it seriously, and had an opportunity. I managed to find Bill Brazel's phone number, which was really a trick I called directory assistance. And I said, Bill Brazel in New Mexico. And they said, yeah, here's the phone number. So I called up and talked to him briefly about it. And then I sent a letter saying that we would be coming down there and we'd like to talk to him. And if you'd like to talk to me, call me collect. And he did. To chat with me about that. And it was really funny. I think my wife was more excited about the phone call than I was. So when we went to Roswell, we had an opportunity to sit down with Bill Brazel, and he told us at that time, he said, well, if I like those boys, I'll help them out. And if I don't, I just won't say anything to them. And we obviously formed some kind of a bond with him, because he certainly helped us out. And one kind of funny story, he said he will take us out to the debris field where he'd seen the debris, where he'd picked up bits of debris. This is Bill Brazel, the son. And we're on the way out there. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. And he says, you boys want a beer? Thinking, yeah, 8 o'clock in the morning, that's what I want. And Don says no. And I'm thinking, well, somebody ought to at least take a beer with the guy. So I said, yeah, I'll take a beer. So I'm 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm drinking a warm beer with Bill Brazel as we're traveling the back roads of New Mexico to this location where he had found the debris back in 1947. So, but I mean, that kind of gives you the chronology of as it developed up until the time that Don and I entered the investigation. Once the book came out, The Roswell Incident by Moore and Berlitz, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in the case. There were some things that were done on television, for example, in a newspaper article or a magazine article here, but for the most part, it was pretty well ignored. And kind of overshadowed by the MJ-12 documents that arrived at Bill Moore's friend's house in, he alleges 1984, and that kind of overshadowed the Roswell case for a long time. But then the QFOS, I'm not sure who it was at QFOS, had talked to Stan about it and said, is there more to be done? And Stan said yes, and that was how we got involved in the investigation. So we started out by talking to some of those people.
Sure. I would like shortly to go back to these first few days of the incident itself, and I'm thinking that actually if the development was not like that, we were maybe not even talking about it today. And this is where sort of a case breaks downs for me in the sense of the logical fallacy and how it is looked today. So Mac Brazel contacts George Wilcox, the sheriff, and they contact 509 bombing group where Jesse Marcel, Sheridan Cavett, and they even get permission from Colonel Blanchard to go with Brazel to the field itself.
Well, I think it's really not getting permission. I think it was more of Marcel telling Blanchard that this is something interesting. We're not sure what it is, and we ought to investigate. And Blanchard said, yeah, that's a good idea. And you've got this CIC guy with you, which would be Cavett. Go on out there and see what you can learn. So they travel out to the ranch site. And according to the documentation I've been able to find and some of the information I've been able to find, they probably left the sheriff's office sometime later than 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Between 4 and 5 o'clock, it's at least a 3-hour drive. And even, I wouldn't say today, but back in 1991, it was even a 3-hour drive from Roswell to Corona, New Mexico, given the way the road networks were. And so you're looking at them getting out there sometime around 8 o'clock in the evening, and it's going to be getting dark soon. So there's not a whole lot they can do. So Blanchard, Marcel and Cavett with Brazel stay overnight in this little line shack, and the next morning Brazel has saddled 2 horses, so Cavett and Brazel are going to ride out on horse, and I think Marcel took the Jeep Carryall, which is a Jeep type vehicle, 4-wheel drive vehicle, and you can get a passenger car out to this field. I mean, even today, and we were driving cross country in passenger cars, so it wasn't that big a deal. And they pick up the debris, and they spend most of the day there looking at the debris, getting the thing picked up. I think Marcel eventually sent Cavett back to the base earlier in the afternoon, and then he went back later in the day. Jesse Jr. tells us that his father woke him up and to show him the debris. And I'm thinking that Marcel probably got back to the house somewhere around 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And given that Jesse Jr. was just 11 at the time, I don't find it completely unusual that he might have been asleep that early, 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Shows him the debris, takes it out to the base. Or actually, there's some indication he may have stayed home and went out to the base first thing in the morning. Anyway, about 8 o'clock in the morning, he's talking to Blanchard about this. And that's the point where Blanchard is calls Walter Hott, the public information officer, to issue a press release. And Walter Hott would say, I do not remember if he dictated the text of the press release over the telephone or if he just gave me the facts and I wrote the press release, but he says he put together the press release and then he circulated it to the 4 media outlets in Roswell, 2 radio stations and 2 newspapers. One of the radio station guy was named George Walsh, and the other guy was Frank Joyce. I don't know why his name escaped me. Frank Joyce. Then both Joyce and Walsh had a direct line to his office, so he could put it on a teletype at his office. Joyce had to go to the Western Union office, apparently, to send this thing on. So the original press release that came out apparently was the first go around was from George Walsh, and about 15 minutes later, Frank Joyce followed on. So the identity of the guy who got the press release out to the world was probably George Walsh. At that point, it was, they've got a flying saucer. Now, the differences in the 2 stories, and one of them was on the UPI, United Press International. I'm not sure the other one was just United Press. But the 2 press releases differ slightly. That suggests that Walter Hott didn't drive to the various locations. He called them and read the press release to them over the phone, and they wrote it. The 2 reporters wrote it from their from their notes that they had made, because they vary just slightly. The facts are there. The tone is just slightly different, things like that. So anyway, the press release goes out. The best estimate, it goes out at about 2:30 Mountain Standard Time in the United States, which would be 4:30 in Washington, D.C., and some ungodly hour in Ireland. But the Western newspapers got it out right away. The Eastern newspapers, because of the deadlines and all of that, were later. But within the 3-hour time frame we have here of the press release actually hitting the wires and Ramey issuing the statement that it's nothing but a weather balloon, about 3 hours transpired. And it's because of the different time zones and things like that, and how they manipulated the movement of various things. So it's clear that it was about 3 hours from the initial press release, "We've got a flying saucer," to we have identified it. At that point, the story dies because the reporters couldn't get a hold of anybody. Mac Brazel's at home. Well, he's actually being held on the base, according to Edwin Easley, the Provost Marshal, think top cop. He's the chief of police, the military chief of police, Major Edwin Easley. So Brazel's being kept at the guest house on the base. Blanchard apparently has gone on leave on a Tuesday afternoon, which makes no sense to me whatsoever as a military guy. Why would you take leave in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon unless it's some sort of an emergency? A family member is gravely ill, or a family member has been injured in a car accident or something like that, and you've got to leave. You don't leave in the middle of the afternoon, especially if you're the base commander. That made no sense to me. But they can't find Blanchard. They can't find Marcel because he's not in Roswell. He's actually in Fort Worth, and he's on the base there. He did make a couple of statements to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, or as a quoted in the Star-Telegram after the initial story had come out in the morning paper. So they can't find anybody who's involved in this other than Ramey. Ramey is at the higher headquarters, so you had a lower headquarters saying, "We got a flying saucer," and the higher headquarters say, "Yeah, no big deal, it's a weather balloon." So the story dies at that point. Nobody's really paying any attention to it. Ted Blocher, who did a analysis of the 1947 wave of UFO sightings based on newspaper articles, actually labeled it as the Roswell hoax. It's not really a hoax in the sense it would be a misidentification, but not a hoax. But he devotes like 3 paragraphs in his massive study to this weather balloon story because it was a big story. It was on the front pages of a lot of newspapers in 1947. But it died very, very quickly, and they moved on to other things. The interesting thing about all of this is, so you've got this all going on July 8th, which, by the way, is 70 years ago today. Yes. You've got all of this going on at the time on July 8th. On July 9th, there's suddenly stories appearing in the newspapers around the country, and I've got copies from lots of different newspapers that said basically the Army and Navy moved today to suppress the stories of flying saucers whizzing through the atmosphere. So up through July 8th, if you read the newspaper articles, the newspaper clippings, nobody cares. They're reporting the story. So-and-so saw these 9 discs. So-and-so did this. So-and-so did that. Crashed in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, for example. It was a big story that turned out to be a hoax. But there was a lot of discussion of flying saucers, a lot of discussion of what they were, very little of it suggesting an interplanetary phenomenon. Today we'd think in terms of interstellar as opposed to interplanetary, but very little suggesting any kind of alien visitation going on. But suddenly on July 9th, the Army and Navy just decided they didn't want to talk about it anymore, and they issued this press release that said they're attempting to suppress the stories. And at that point, the number of sightings being reported to the newspapers and the reports in the newspapers drop off precipitously.
Exactly, and the main point when they were together on the field, and later in the interviews with On.Kevin, the CIC officer that was there, he said several times that it was a weather balloon and he could recognize it immediately. However, this is the problem, right? Because why they were going through all this trouble, sending material to Fort Worth, even to Wright Patterson in Dayton, Ohio, while they could resolve it immediately. Now, the only thing that could logically save it slightly, if the Mogul remains, the third official explanation, were so different and extraordinary compared to ordinary weather balloon. So this is the thing that sort of never fit for me, never.
Well, let me make one comment here that I think is important, is that we interviewed, and I say we, Don Schmidt and I interviewed Cavett. I think we were the first to really get him to talk. We met with him in Arizona, where he was wintering with his wife near Fort Huachuca. And if you all were familiar with United States Army military installations, you would realize that Fort Huachuca is sort of the home of Army intelligence, and that's where they train intelligence officers and all of that sort of thing. So we meet with him at Sierra Vista, Arizona, and we asked him about this. And he said, we never went out to pick up balloons. We were too busy with other stuff to be worried about picking up balloons. So he actually denied that they went out and picked up a balloon. The only time I ever saw him get nervous, Don and I were sitting in the living room with him. His wife was in the kitchen preparing lemonade or something for us. And Don was kind of chatting with her. I'm talking to Cavett. And this is annoying Cavett because he can't concentrate on what's going on all around him because I've got his attention and his wife may be saying something else. And I said something about alien bodies. And he said to me, Bill Rickett tell you that? And I'm thinking, let's protect Bill Rickett. And I said, no, we got it from Edwin Easley. But when I said about the alien bodies, he said, Bill Rickett tell you that. He had leaned forward, picked up a magazine off the coffee table, thrown it back down, leaned back, and then said, did Bill Rickett tell you that? And when I said, no, Edwin Easley did, he visibly relaxed. And I thought, well, I blew it there. I should have said, yes, Bill Rickett told us the whole damn story. But we asked him specifically about this, and he said, no, I was too busy with, or we were too busy, meaning Rickett and the CIC staff were too busy with what they were doing. What they were doing was basically trying to get people their Q clearances so they could deal with the atomic weapons and that sort of thing, that we didn't have time for any of these balloon sideshows, I think he called them. The other thing you have to remember about Mogul is on July 10th, there was a paper in the there was an article in the Alamogordo News, which was a newspaper right outside Holloman Air Force Base, at the time Alamogordo Army Air Field, where they were launching the balloons. And there were pictures of the balloon arrays. There's a picture on the front page of the paper, and there's a step ladder in it, and a guy got on the step ladder. And Charles Moore, who was one of the guys on the project there, said, yeah, that's the ladder I bought with petty cash from our sources there. So the Mogul was so secret that they were putting pictures of it on the front page of the newspaper. And what Mogul consisted of was common weather balloons and ray wind targets. They did launch a couple of sonobuoys with it. Those were microphones, and there was a device on it that would drop sandbags, which was designed to keep the balloons at a constant level. So when they hit a certain level, this device would kick in, and as it started to sink, as the balloon started to sink, it would drop some of the ballast, leak the ballast out to keep them at a constant level. There was nothing in this array train that would be unrecognizable to Marcel or Cavett. They would have both recognized the weather balloons for what they were, the ray wind targets for what they were. There might have been, the sonobuoy might have not been easily recognizable to them, but they would have recognized it as being of terrestrial manufacture. So this Mogul idea fails at that point, but it really fails, and this is what I've never understood, is if I'm an ardent skeptic and I got a document that says to me that there's a lack of crash-recovered debris. This is the line from the Twining memo from September of 1947. And to them, that's gospel. It proves that there was no Roswell crash because Twining should have known about it. And why would he say with a lack of crash-recovered debris if there was, in fact, crash-recovered debris? So they accept that without question. On the flip side of that, we have a statement from Albert Crary, who is was the chief of the project in New Mexico, the Mogul balloon project, if you will. More insisted on calling it the New York University balloon project because that's what they were doing. They didn't know what the ultimate purpose was. They knew it was part of Project Mogul because you see in Crary's diary, he mentions the name Mogul several times. So that even that wasn't classified. But they're using off-the-shelf weather balloons and that sort of thing. So there's really nothing there to fool them. But Crary's diary also says that the June 4th launch, which is the one they point to as being the culprit because there's nothing about the scientific information recovered from that, because it says it was canceled. The June 4th launch was canceled. Every other balloon flight is accounted for. So it can't be any other flight. It has to be the one that would have been launched on June 4th, 1947. And the diary says it was canceled. And the skeptics will argue till they're blue in their face about that doesn't mean that they didn't launch a Mogul flight, even though it says it was canceled.
Yes, I read those debates on your blog, and they're quite often discussing that point. But yeah, I think you described nicely, actually. If the Mogul balloon was sort of in a similar, they just had this additional equipment. I guess the microphone, and I think they were transmitting, I guess, sort of open microphone, and that is the way how they tried to get the sounds from the potential atomic experiments, right? Was that the concept?
Well, the microphone was supposed to pick up the sound of the detonation, and that would be transmitted by radio back to the listening station, wherever it might have been. But they never got it to work very well, and that sort of thing. But I covered all this. I did a book last year called Roswell in the 21st Century, and there's a long appendix that makes all the arguments about Project Mogul from the point where it said it was canceled, the fact that Mogul is mentioned in Crary's diary, and he's talking about the Mogul equipment that and that they had gone to Roswell. When I say they, the Mogul people, the New York University people had gone to Roswell to ask them for their assistance in tracking their balloons, and the Roswell people said, we got important stuff to do. We can't be playing with all these college projects. At one point, Crary and somebody else in a weapons carrier, which is kind of an open tracked vehicle is what it is. And they had drawn the equipment from Alamogordo Army Air Field, and they were chasing down their balloons that way. And at one point, Crary and another fellow had to go to the Roswell Army Air Field for gas, to gas up their weapons carrier. So they know what's going on. The June 5th launch, which was the first real launch in New Mexico, it fell east of Roswell, and Moore and another guy picked it up in a weapons carrier, and they were running out of gas, and they drove to the front gate of Roswell with the balloon remains in the back of the weapons carrier, for crying out loud, to ask for assistance. Moore says they weren't allowed on the base, and I just do not believe that for two reasons. A, Crary had been on the base not that much earlier with a weapons carrier, and they're driving a vehicle that is clearly registered to the Alamogordo Army Air Field. The bumper has numbers and codes on it that would have told the gate guards that this was a military vehicle. Not to mention there would have been what's called a triptych, which is a ticket or a document that you put down the mileage and all of that stuff, where you went and the mileage, so they can keep track of that sort of thing for some bizarre reason. The military does that. And could have showed them that documentation, which would have been a legitimate reason to allow them on the base. But Moore says now they wouldn't allow them on the base. So I don't believe that story. But the real point is, so they're carrying the remains of a Mogul balloon in the back of their weapons carrier, open for everybody to see if they had gotten onto the base at Roswell. So, there's all kinds of these things arguing against the validity of it being a Mogul balloon or a Mogul balloon array. And the skeptics will argue that point until they're blue in the face. And I just don't get why they just reject the idea that the diary says the flight was canceled, and they cannot live with that. Because what it boils down to, if we eliminate Mogul from the list of possible explanations, and pretty much everything has been eliminated.
Exactly.
You have a problem with the not having an explanation. You can't say it was this, that, or the other thing. You're saying, well, this thing fell, and we all agree it fell, but we don't know exactly what it was. So there you go.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair estimation. I mean, I would not even go beyond that also, and I know that's your standpoint. And this historical drama that we just described, that was always actually fascinating to me, even from the historical standpoint. And it's hard to go beyond that. We can, of course, have some indications, but it's hard to, of course, present something in the National Museum and so on. That's completely understandable. But yeah, there are both sides of the point sometimes get too extreme. And I think we can now move to the 90s and the pressure and the research and everything what was happening, that actually government had to respond, like we just said, with the Mogul idea, and then with the GOA investigation and the dummies explanation, which was the fourth one. But I guess Mogul was sort of actually the only thing that they were left, and that should sort of explain the security environment when everything was happening, because the witnesses were explaining very tight security for the transfer of the materials and so on. So I guess Mogul was sort of a thing to latch to explain this kind of a top secret environment.
Mogul was suggested, as you say, was suggested as a reason for all this security. But if you look back at the records, you find out that the only thing that was classified about Mogul was the ultimate purpose, which was to spy on the Soviet Union, put balloons up so we could monitor whether they were testing atomic weapons or not. That was the purpose of Mogul. But everybody else knew about Mogul, knew that it was an attempt to create a constant level balloon. And there's nothing secret about that. The Japanese during the Second World War had used similar things to bomb the United States. They had launched some 9,000 what they called fugo balloons, or firebombing balloons, and their idea was that these balloons would be carried by the jet stream across the Pacific Ocean, and at a certain point, after a certain number of cycles where it would go up and down based on the heating of the atmosphere or the balloons by the sun, and then the cooling, and when the sun was gone, after a certain number of cycles, it would drop its bombs. And the bombs were normally they were really high explosive. They're mostly incendiary devices because the idea was to set things on fire. And it turned out that while that had limited success, that some of the balloons actually did make it to the United States, they were found as far eastern as Michigan, I think, which was way far east. And some were found in Canada. The remains of them were found in Canada, some in Mexico, and a number of them on the western coast of the United States. And it was responsible for the only casualties on the continental United States during World War II, where a group of picnickers had found one of the balloons laying on the ground and were pulling on various things, and the thing blew up and killed 6 people. And so the balloons had a certain limited success. They got here. The Japanese didn't know they had gotten here because they thought the Americans were much too open in their society, that if the balloons had arrived here, they would know about it by looking at the newspapers and that sort of thing. And there was a real prohibition on releasing any information about it. I did talk to a woman in Iowa who had been a reporter in 1947, and one of the balloons had fallen in Iowa and had been recovered, and she was going to do a story about it, but the FBI showed up and asked her not to print the story because of national security. She said, okay. And the day the war ended, she printed her story about the balloons. But the point is, a lot of balloon research had been going on during the war, after the war, so that Mogul wasn't that big a deal in and of itself. It was the ultimate purpose. So there was no reason for the security. I mean, they're printing pictures of Mogul in the newspapers on July 10th, 1947. So clearly it's not this big secret that it's alleged to be. And if it's not the big secret, then you have to try to figure out what happened that caused all this tight security and all the activities that went on, because that is well documented. We can document something failed. We can document the response by all kinds of people to this sort of thing. So you've got all of that to work your way through. So Mogul simply doesn't work as an explanation for that reason as well.
Yeah, and that is where the case breaks down from official perspective today, and that is so frustrating. And when we really look into data, like you just explained, it is not holding up. It's like some another layer was happening there. It's really strange. Can we now go to the Stephen Schiff's investigation in the 90s? I'm also interested to learn, did you have any contacts with Stephen Schiff's office at the time when GOA investigation was happening? And I think they are saying that actually Air Force made a preemptive strike with their Mogul while GOA was still was there, like they are still doing their job, and it was still not finished when they published their own Mogul explanation. Is that correct?
Well, we've got to break this thing down a bit.
Sure.
I had no contact with Schiff's office, but I did have contact with the Air Force investigators. James McAndrew called me a number of times. And he was always pressing me to say, listen, you can say you're just in it for the money and nobody's going to think less of you. What do you really think happened? That kind of thing. Because if he could flip one of the investigators, that would be a real coup. And I told him, no, I'm not in it for the money. I'd have done this whole thing for free, which in essence I did, or paid for it with my own money to get to New Mexico and all that sort of thing. We recouped some of that money with the books, but we spent an awful lot of money getting the information. But the Air Force investigation, I think, was probably inspired by Schiff's office wanting to get information about what had happened at Roswell. And Schiff was a representative from the state of New Mexico, so it was his constituency who was interested in this sort of thing. I talked to Richard Weaver, who was the Air Force officer in charge, Colonel Weaver, and he said that their mission was not to explain Roswell, but to look for documentation. And so that's what they were doing. They were going to the various agencies looking for documentation about the Roswell case. They went to the CIA, the FBI, and all these various government agencies that might have had something to do with this and asked them if they had any documentation that related to the Roswell case. Weaver also told me that he was the one responsible for getting Crairy's diary and then publishing it in the Air Force report and gathering all the documents from the New York University about their Mogul idea. I think the Mogul idea actually originated with Robert Todd, who was a UFO researcher, somewhat of a curmudgeonly UFO researcher. He was really kind of a nasty guy, doing his work and proposed the Project Mogul to the Air Force, and they kind of ran with that. But if you go through their report, their big thick first one, it's just all this stuff about the New York University project, which is valuable for us when we want to refute Project Mogul, but it really doesn't lead you to that conclusion, especially when you read the stuff in the back of the report, like Crairy's diary. And the executive summary, which is all that the reporters would ever read, kind of leads you to the conclusion, well, we've explained all this, and the witnesses are a bunch of liars and all of that sort of thing. Interestingly enough, I had offered them the tapes with General Exxon, and they didn't want to hear those. I offered them the tapes with Edwin Easley, and they weren't interested in hearing those. They didn't want that stuff. And I'm thinking, well, here are two high-ranking military officers, Air Force officers, and they don't want to get into an argument or calling these guys liars. It doesn't matter if they call some of the lower-ranking people or the people who are not retired military officers liars. They don't care about that, or the civilians, but they didn't want to call a general officer and some colonels liars about what they had said to us. So they just kind of ignored that information. So Weaver was saying that what they were doing was looking for documentation in government agencies, and they didn't find any. And I'm not surprised. When I was doing my investigation of this, I had sent a letter to the Secretary of the Air Force, who was the one that commissioned Weaver and McAndrew to do their thing, asking for any notes of meetings, reports that had been given, preliminary reports, minutes from the meetings, anything like that would be available. And they sent me in response to my FOIA request, they sent me to the government printing offices. Everything's gone to the government printing office. And I'm thinking, that's a load of crap. The document went there, but all this other stuff didn't. And so pro forma, I wrote to the government printing office, and they just sent me a price list. I went back to the Secretary of the Air Force. And they said, well, everything we had went to the Air Force Archives at Maxwell Air Force Base. So I went to Maxwell Air Force Base, and they said, no, we don't have it. We sent it all to the National Archives in Washington. So I went to the National Archives in Washington. And when I say I went there, I didn't physically go there. I sent them FOIA requests via mail. And they wrote back and said, no, we don't have it. It's still at Maxwell. So I wrote to Maxwell, and they said, well, they do have it. And I finally got back to National Archives and said, well, we do have it. And I eventually went to the National Archives and looked at stuff, but there wasn't anything that really related to the investigation. There was a lot of other ancillary nonsense in there. There was a copy of the videotape that the Fund for UFO Research had done on their video project of videotaping the witnesses, and they put together a videotape of this, and that videotape was in there, for example. There was a court-martial of an Army doctor who was having an affair with a nurse in 1957, for God's sakes, which has nothing to do with this. They weren't very clever in their affair. They would go to El Paso, which is 4 hours from Roswell, and get a motel room. And one weekend they would take his car, and the next weekend they'd take hers, and they'd stay at the same motel. So it wasn't hard to figure it out. And there were three allegedly pornographic pictures. When they searched the doctor's quarters, they found these alleged photographic pictures. I mean, I've seen far better pictures and printed in magazines in the 1980s, for crying out loud. It's hardly pornographic, but there was a court-martial. It had no relevance to that. But that was the sort of thing that we had. So we had that big investigation, but it did what it was designed to do, which was show that there were government agencies wouldn't respond to saying we have documentation. And they could go out and say, well, we could find no evidence of anything extraterrestrial falling at Roswell. And the news media said, yeah, okay, we got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and that was the end. And like Kevin just explained, he offered his recordings and Air Force declined. And he gave me today permission to actually play one of the clips. And I think I really appreciate this, Kevin, because as I'm calling a lot of pilots, and I actually recently had an interview with the general in the former Yugoslavia, and I know the feelings when you try to call, when you are doing it through old ways, trying to find numbers, when somebody's connect you with the other person, how it is hard to do it. So I wanted just to put people into shoes of a researcher, of a caller, of person who is gathering and archiving information, which is really important. So I guess. Well,
let me interrupt you, and I don't mean to do this, but we've got to look at this. Was done in 1990, 1989, 1990, 1991. We're using telephones. We don't have Skype. We don't have the internet, and there's long distance charges. So every month I'm spending $200 or $300 a month on telephone bills, calling witnesses, trying to get a hold of them, trying to find phone numbers. Today you type a name into the internet and you get to the white pages there, and you can probably find their number easily. Back then there was something they actually published at one point a national phone book on CD. And so you could use that to help find some of the stuff. And I know Don had used some of his connections to find phone numbers and that sort of thing. So back then it was much harder to find. Once we got a name, now we've got to A, figure out where they are, and B, get a phone number and then call on the telephone, as opposed to using Skype or our cell phones that we could use today. So it was a much more difficult process back then than it is today.
Exactly. And so much time, effort, and money was put into it. So I wanted to play the clip with Major Edwin Easley, which is very short. And after that, you can sort of introduce him to us and what you learned with discussions with him. So here is the clip.
And I understand you were the Provost Marshal at one time.
That's right.
At the 509th.
Yes.
During July of 1947?
Yeah.
Pardon me?
Yes.
Yes. You're aware of the incident that took place there in July of 47? The alleged crash of a flying saucer?
I've heard about it.
first-hand knowledge of it?
Do what?
Do you have any first-hand knowledge of the incident?
I can't talk about it.
Then you do have some first-hand knowledge?
I can't talk about it.
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
Well, we have received information from a couple of people that you had been out at the crash site yourself as a Provost Marshal. So that was what we were trying to confirm. But you can't talk about it, right?
That's right.
Can you tell me if you were at the crash site?
I can't talk about it. I told you that.
Yes, sir, I understand.
I've been sworn to secrecy. I can't tell you that.
Uh-huh.
I'm not going to talk about it.
And that was it. The last part was a little bit of bad quality, but he said he's sworn to secrecy. But anyway, I wanted just to show the listeners the inside sort of a data that researchers have and sort of a disconnect with today's generalizations. But anyway, can you explain the saga with Easley? And he was a very important person in the whole case.
Looking at the staff, the military staff at the Roswell Army Air Field, one of the people that we wanted to talk to, of course, was the Provost Marshal, the Chief of Police. He'd be responsible for security. If there was security thrown up around the crash site, he would have been responsible for it. He might have delegated that responsibility to one of his subordinates, but ultimately it was his responsibility. So I wanted to talk to him about that. I had found his number, and I don't remember if I got it off a reunion list or I'd learned where he lived and managed to get it out of directory assistance, but I did get his phone number. I called him up and began the conversation, said I wanted to talk about the alleged spacecraft crash in Roswell, New Mexico. And the first thing he says, I can't talk about it. And now I'm flabbergasted because that's not the response I expected. And so I'm trying to think of questions to ask him that would gather some information about it. And he would keep saying to me, I can't talk about it. I was sworn to secrecy. Now, in the military, normally when you attend a classified briefing, there is usually a notice. There is a notice at the beginning of the briefing and probably at the end as well, saying, the contents of this briefing are classified. It cannot be discussed with people who are not cleared to know it, and the penalties for discussing it outside proper chain of command is this, and this. So being sworn to secrecy can take on a really important connotation, or it's just sort of a matter of routine. But he was very adamant he couldn't talk about it. No matter what question I asked, it usually came back to I can't talk about it, unless it was something he felt was outside that purview. He could talk about those sorts of things, which is how I learned that Roswell had been held in the guest house on the base as opposed to in the brig. Or that's the stockade, I guess would be the proper term. But so once I got done with the conversation, I said, well, if I think of anything else, do you mind if I call you back? And he said, yeah, go ahead. So he was very cordial about that. It just, he didn't want to violate this oath he took back in 1947, saying that he would not talk about this stuff specifically. I had an opportunity to speak to him. I think it was February 2nd, 1990. I was at the QFOS office in Chicago, and they were having their board meeting, and they said, hey, use the telephone, make some phone calls if you want to. And I got a whole list of people that I would love to talk to, and now I have access to a telephone that's not going to cost me any money. So one of the people I called was Edwin Easley, and we were chatting about this whole thing. And I said to him in the conversation, are we following the right path? And Easley said to me, what do you mean? I said, we think it was extraterrestrial. And he said, well, let me put it this way, you're not following the wrong path. Well, because I was at QFOS, I didn't record the conversation, but I immediately interrupted the board meeting and told him what I just learned from Easley. And people have said to me, well, you didn't have a recorder. If he just said that, I'd have gone out and bought one and come back and called him again. Why? I'm going to be going home. I can talk to him at some point about this. We can look at all of that sort of thing later. did not know that he was about to be diagnosed with terminal cancer. Mark Rodiger, the scientific director, said to me one day, I'm going to be in Fort Worth. Can you set up a meeting with me and Easley? And I said, yeah, I'd be great. Let's have another person talk to him and get this information. That would be marvelous. So I sent a note to him, and I got a long, nice letter from one of the daughters, and told me that her father was gravely ill. Her mother was paranoid, thought we were trying to do something nefarious to her husband. She was scared to death, but we'd lost the opportunity to get that. It was just one of those bad timing things. Had I known he was going to get ill, I would have gone out and bought a tape recorder and called him right back. Or when I got home, I would have called him right back and gotten the same answer from him, but didn't realize that there was an urgency to this sort of thing. So Easley was important because he confirmed that Brazel had been held, that he'd been held not in a jail, but in the guest house. But I'm thinking, even if you're in the guest house and you're not allowed to leave, that's you're virtually incarcerated. We've got testimony from any number of people who knew Mac Brazel saying that he was livid about being incarcerated at the base and that sort of thing. He was seen in the custody of military personnel in downtown Roswell as he was making his way to the Roswell Daily Record so he could give that interview to the newspaper about finding the debris and all of that sort of thing. So Easley confirmed some things like that. He confirmed that there was interest at the highest levels. He confirmed that people were sworn to secrecy about this, and had it been a Mogul balloon, that wouldn't have been that big a deal, and all of that sort of thing. So Easley was important in that respect. Unfortunately, the one critical conversation I had with him I didn't record because of the circumstances it came about.
Yeah, but I can definitely say that I think it's completely from A to Z exactly as it happened, and your career shows it. As a researcher I'm following for some time. At least that is my impression. Well,
I did make notes during the conversation, exactly. And I have those notes, and in a lot of environments, those notes would be sufficient evidence that the conversation took place and was substantially what I said. And it wasn't like I made the notes after the conversation, or I made the notes during the conversation. So I have those notes, and they have been reviewed by other people, by the way.
Exactly. Well, I had so many questions, Kevin, and I even had so many audio clips, but I didn't actually want to interrupt you because I wanted to hear as much information from you as I could. So I guess for the end, we can talk about your book, your current standpoint of the case. How do you look at it today? And is there any next step that we have in this whole drama?
I decided... Well, actually, I didn't. I had decided that I wanted to do a sort of the ultimate Roswell book, look at all the evidence. While I was in Roswell in 2011, I think it was, Tom Carey and I went to lunch at the Church's Fried Chicken. And anybody who knows me knows I would not turn down an invitation to go to eat lunch at Church's Fried Chicken. Okay. And he proposed that Tom and I, write a book. The ultimate Roswell book, and I said, yeah, great, let's do it. He eventually invited in Don Schmidt, and there were other people that became involved, but the whole project kind of blew up. It just didn't work out the way I wanted it to, and Tom and Don got sidetracked by the Roswell slides. So I decided, well, I'm going to just do the book myself. So I did Roswell in the 21st century, as sort of look at it as a cold case book, review the evidence, review as much of the evidence I could, review the tapes, review the transcripts, review all that kind of material, see what I could put together. And what I did was do that sort of thing, looking at the witnesses as dispassionately as I could, to see if they're had a history of telling tall tales, for example. And, the Frank Kaufman story springs to mind immediately, with him and his being out on the crash site and all the things he did when we found out that he had basically made the whole thing up. And, just review all of that, seeing how the connections worked out. For example, why did we listen to Frank Kaufman? Well, Walter Haut told us about him. And I remember standing on North Main Street, outside the building where the museum was housed originally, not where it is now, across from the Greyhound bus studio. And I said to Walter Haut, and Don's standing right there, what about Frank Kaufman? And Walter Haut says, anything Frank Kaufman tells you is golden. Well, we found out that what Frank Kaufman told us wasn't golden. It was fabricated. And so that calls into question Walter Haut. So I mentioned all of that in the book, that these are the relationships that we have to understand. I did a long section on MJ-12, I did a long section on Project Mogul, did a long section on the plains of San Augustine. All these sorts of things that I think were important to the case, and looked at the even the Roswell slides as that whole thing developed. And so the book looks at all of that evidence, puts it into the best context I can. There's like 1,000 footnotes in the book, so you know where the information came from. And I tried to get it back to the original source. For example, if it was an interview that I conducted with a witness, that is the source, personal interview conducted on such and such a date. If it's somebody else conducted the interview, that's in the book. It wasn't, well, I read this other book and it's quoted there. If the information has appeared in other books, I tried to cite them as well, but also in the context of the footnotes, you get the original source of the information. So you can look at it all as first-hand investigation, as opposed to sitting down and reading a book and putting together another book, reading a series of books and articles and putting together another book about it. So that was kind of the inspiration for Roswell in the 21st century. And unfortunately, when you look at it dispassionately, you try to take your bias out of it, whatever your bias might be, whether it's anti-Roswell or pro-Roswell, but look at it, where does the evidence take us? What we end up with, we've eliminated the terrestrial answers, but we don't have the one thing that would allow us to make the leap to the extraterrestrial, the bits of debris, photographs of the alien bodies, something that can be something that is tangible, something that can be touched, to show that you've moved to the extraterrestrial. You can get there by a leap of logic, which is basically when all the possible answers are eliminated, what you're left with, no matter how impossible, must be the right answer. And I think we've eliminated all the terrestrial answers. So what are we left with? Well, unless there's something else out there, and it's a distinct possibility there is. Nick Redfern, for example, in his latest book, talks about this Unit 731, which was a Japanese project during World War II, and some of those scientists were brought to the United States and may have been responsible for some kind of an experiment that is responsible for the Roswell debris. I don't buy in his explanation, but I mean, he's looked at it from another perspective, if you will, and so you've got to look at all of that sort of thing. But when you get all done, if you're honest with yourself, you have to say, well, all of this is very intriguing, and we really don't have a good explanation. It is, in essence, unidentified, but that doesn't mean positively it was an alien spacecraft. We need something more to prove that point of view. We can say that's where the evidence leads us, but we haven't quite reached that point yet.
Yeah, and that's a really good objective conclusion, and we shouldn't be afraid to say we don't know. And I think everything else is just unfortunate distraction, and this is the core of the case that we just gone through. Okay, Kevin, I know you have a great podcast show, a different perspective, and your blog. Can you point the listeners to your blog? I'm such a fan of your podcast show, actually, and I archive it. I have every single episode. I'm archiving it in my folder with dates and everything. So, but can you point the listeners to your show?
Well, not wanting to be snooty, but it's not just a podcast. It's also broadcast on the radio.
Great.
So you can listen to it if you're in the right areas. You can listen to it on the radio. You can pick it up on over the internet. I usually put up on my blog, which is www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. I usually put there just a little brief synopsis of the show and a link to where you can listen to it on the internet. If you type a different perspective and Kevin Randle into YouTube, it'll give you a whole long list of the programs that we've done, and you can select the ones you want to listen to and the ones you don't want to listen to. So you can do all of that, but it's on the X Zone Broadcast Network, and if you go to xzbn.net, and follow the link to me, it'll give you a list of places you can listen to the program as well. So there's many, many platforms that we are on now with the program. And this last week, tonight, I shouldn't say this last week, tonight, well, it's really not tonight. My latest show is with Mark O'Connell, who has done a book called The Close Encounters Man, which is an authorized biography of J. Allen Hynek, which I think was kind of interesting. And next week, we will be doing a program about some of the problems with MUFON and the investigations done by Don Ecker. So, those are the next two programs coming up for me. But once again, you can find it at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And for all the books, I guess Amazon is the best point, right?
Amazon's got the books. Roswell in the 21st Century is at Amazon. You can click on it and be reading it in like 2 minutes. The only problem with that, you can also get a hard copy. The other thing I should say, there's no index with the book, which annoyed a bunch of people. There is an index available online at my website, or at my website, at my blog. You just type in Roswell in 21st Century Index, and there's an index for you. If you want an index, that's the way to get the index.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and it was such a pleasure to talk with you tonight.
Well, it was a lot of fun talking with you as well.
Thanks so much, Kevin. I hope we can do something similar in the future.
We certainly can. Not a problem.
I would like to thank Mr. Randle once again for finding a time to be a guest on my show. And for then, I will left you with this. This is the segment from the Pentagon News Conference from July 1997, where Colonel John Haynes was grilled by the journalists about proposed theory of test drop dummies. In this clip, Haynes is actually trying to explain how the witnesses confused the initial Roswell event from 1947 with test drop dummies, training exercises that happened 6 years later in 1953. So that was the theory of the Air Force, that witnesses confused two events and merged it into one. It is up to you to decide, are you happy with that? So let's hear what was the reaction in the conference room. That's all for tonight, and see you again in the next episode.
Yes, ma'am.
Colonel, let me just clear up two things that you sort of brushed over quickly. Number one was the time frame that people are going to say, but this is 10 years. How could they possibly make a mistake on the 10 years? And number two, you said it was never classified, and yet why didn't people at the time say, well, my goodness, we were having dummy tests, this explains the answer?
Well, the dummy test, actually, you need to get the book. Actually, you need to look in there. If you look in there, you'll find there are a couple of things in which the dummy tests get lots of media attention. I have it tabbed, and I should be able to find it, but quite frankly, I'm sitting here and my knees are shaking.
Explain those two things.
But let me tell you that I don't know why they can't associate that time period. I'm sorry, I just don't have any information for that. And I don't mean Roswell in 47, because that was Project Mogul. That was unmanned. I want to make that very clear. And that's the first report. But over that period of time, dummies were dropped all around there. And I think it's logical to assume that the people there saw Air Force ambulances come out, they saw gurneys come out, they saw body bags come out because the dummies were put into body bags to protect them. They saw people in pith helmets. They saw people in shorts out there brushing the bushes looking for the remnants of the balloons. And when you put all that stuff together and spin it, you find that it fits perfectly with many of the occurrences in Roswell during that era.
They also said that these figures were much smaller stature than full-size adult figures. How do you reconcile that?
I don't reconcile that. I just have no idea why they say that.
Can you help us with when the dummies were first used? What year?
53.
Colonel, let me just go back one more time. That you say this is case closed and people should now believe it, but with the major hole, though, of you're saying that they're wrong about the date, and the date being 6 years' time that they're wrong about. What explanation can you give them other than just saying, well, we just think they're just mistaken by 6 years?
I have no other explanation. I'm sorry. I have no other explanation. I'm looking at the facts as we have studied them. And I have no other explanation for that but what I've already given.
But how would
Yes,
that
sir.
make it case closed?
Because we've reviewed all the relevant information and we have finished this and we're not going to revisit it.